Hola, buenas tardes, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our series of children's literature at the UCLA Latin American Institute. Today, we have the honor of having our guest speaker, our award-winning author and translator, David Bowles. He is a Mexican-American author and translator from South Texas, where he teaches at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. Among his 3 dozen award-winning books they Call Me Güero, my two border towns, and Ancient Night. David also personally serves also as the vice president of the Texas Institute of Letters. And today he's going to be discussing the importance of and the process of translating children's literature into Spanish. Muchas gracias, David, for joining us and for
Gracias,
your
Vero. I'm
generosity.
so excited to be talking to everyone tonight about something that's near and dear to my heart, and that is the use of Spanish in children's literature, and also, the bringing in of Spanish literature and translating it into English so it's accessible to people who don't know Spanish. And so I'm going to be talking about a diverse series of topics. And the best way for me to do that is to share my screen and use oh my gosh, okay, what happened here? Give me 1 second while I reorient myself. I pushed the wrong button. And you also then won't have to stare at my face the entire time, which is always a plus. I always think about webinars and Zoom calls and about how much how much time we spend trying to compose ourselves and have this una expresión así, dignified, and when we're just kind of oh, it's an unusual, very artificial way of dealing with things. So I've called my presentation Home Language: Crafting Spanish Versions of Books for Kids and Teens, because, as Vero said in her introduction, I do that work. I've got about 36 books out, and nearly half of them are translations. Translations of my own work, translations of other people's work. So I've had this really um, storied experience working as a translator. A little bit about myself. I am from Deep South Texas. My dad's family came to this area, into the northern Mexico, South Texas area, about 250 years ago with Escandon, when he brought a couple dozen mestizo families and a dozen or so Tlaxcalteca, Nahua families out of the Saltillo area up into here. And they settled, they colonized the area, and the Huahuitecan peoples that lived here, for the most part, were either absorbed into that population or eliminated, although some still remain, like the Istokna, the Carrizo Comecrudo people, whose community, whose ancestral land my house actually sits on. So I always think it's really important to recognize them. And my mom's family, my mom's family, not Mexican American, came out of Oklahoma during the Great Depression, and came into this area to pick grapefruit and oranges, which is something you don't see a lot of Anglos doing anymore. But I grew up on the border, and a lot of my relatives still live in Mexico. As a child, I would go all the time to visit my great-grandmother, Genoveva Ramirez and Reynosa. And so a lot of my work is influenced by growing up in a Mexican American community on the border with a foot on either bank. And it's also one of the reasons that I find translating so important. I want to give you some background on the industry, because for the longest time, it was unheard of for anybody to make translations into Spanish for the U.S. market. That was something, you sold translation rights abroad to a publisher in Spain or Mexico or Argentina, so that they would then, in those countries, publish a Spanish version of a book. It was really unusual for you to translate a book that was published in English in the US into Spanish and publish it in the US. So really, it was just not done. And I want to just give you kind of a feel about how we came to this place where it's a lot more common. So before 1970, well, in the first place, there really wasn't a body of literature written by U.S. Latinos before 1970, published in the U.S. There were a couple of books, like maybe one or two every decade would get published. and make a bit of a splash. But for the most part, the community, la comunidad latina in the US was excluded from publishing. You would, however, see books from Latin America translated into English and brought into the market, especially if they exoticized, especially South American and Central American countries at a time when a lot of U.S. corporations were trying to extract resources from those countries, and so it was about showing those countries in this really appealing way that othered them and kind of centered the richness of those countries as an appeal for tourism and for extraction, right? But then in the early 70s, we did have this rise of publications in the US, beginning with people like Tomas Rivera, um, and like Rudy Anaya and other people whose books made a big splash in the early 70s. And so a lot of those books that were being published in the 70s and 80s and in the early 90s, intermittently though there wasn't like this massive movement with, dozens of books every year or anything. It was just a smattering here and there. A lot of those books were bilingual, or used code switching, to some degree or another. And so, there was a lot of Spanish in them. So by the mid 90s, as awards for books written by gente latina began to arise, like the Americas Award, the Tomas Rivera Mexican American Children's Book Award, the Pura Belpré Award, given out by the American Library Association, all three of which I have received and been very, very proud to be conferred. Um, a group of, I guess, of like professors and professional translators, whatever, kind of came together during this period of time to in their minds protect I don't know, I don't know a really good word for it, like the sanctity, the purity of the Spanish language as it was being used in these books. They wanted to make sure that if there was Spanish in a book being published in the US, that Spanish not be impoverished, que no fuera empobrecido by the publishing industry. They wanted to make sure that the accents were there correctly, that it was like this kind of like flattened, globally understandable Spanish that they taught in their classes at the university and in high schools and elementary, bilingual elementary schools. And it was, I mean, it's a worthy mission, I think, at first. Certainly, well intended, but the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and so there came a point at which that cadre of gatekeepers kind of had to step away or had to change their view on things, because starting in 2014, 2015, there was a rise in the need to to publish books, for uh, kids in the US who spoke Spanish. So, I really noticed this around 2016. That was when I was, first asked to do some translation work. There was like this demand from school districts who were serving Spanish speaking children, and it reached this critical mass that convinced publishers, hey, there's money to be made in translation. Y nada más vieron los signos de dólar and like they were like, boom, let's do it. They tried some out, thinking that okay, maybe there is a market for this, and sales went through the roof, and they were like, oh wow, okay, yes, we've hit upon something. You see this happening also like with Hollywood. I'm sure that you've noticed when movies like Coco come out and suddenly, or Encanto, and suddenly, these movies make tons of money, and there's all these reports coming out about how many, gente Latina goes to see the movies and how much the box office depends on our patronage. And then suddenly everybody is waiting. Oh, okay, there's going to be a sea change, and we're going to have a lot more movies, featuring this Hispanic, Latina families, but it just never it never really gels. It's this weird thing. But with publishing, it did. It was like just a perfect storm because also there was a rise in original work being written for the market by you know Latinx writers, and so it was really perfect. So by 2023, last year, one of the things that a lot of us who do translation have noticed is there are not enough translators now. Not enough translators because what they want is, and I'll kind of like as I talk about my work, I'll hopefully help you to see this. They want people who are writers themselves, who are Latina writers for of children's literature doing the translation because they feel that we're going to be better equipped. We're going to understand the marketplace better. We're going to understand the kind of language that our readers are expecting and on things like that. So now it is, there's a high demand, and it's as a result. I mean, I don't want to like sound really greedy or anything, but as a result, it's easier for you to negotiate like better deals. We have been able to insist on getting paid better, on having credit on the cover as the translator, because it used to be it would just be whatever author in the title of their book, and unless the person translating were super reputable, like when Elena Poniatowska translated House on Mango Street by Sandra Siones, well, of course they're going to put her name on it because it's Elena Poniatowska, right? But if you were not of that stature, your name was not going to go on the cover. You would just be on the inside flat. Um, and even now, some publishers are paying translators royalties because they really have to. I mean, there are not enough of us to go around, and they're just trying to find ways to make it work. And this is good because it means that there's a lot more Spanish books in schools that kids can have access to that are being translated by people who are authors and who are going to craft in their Spanish version something that isn't just, you know, like a word for word or phrase for phrase translation, but something that feels like freshly created as if it, even though it was originally written in English, as if it were originally written in Spanish, which is the illusion that a translator kind of wants to create, that when you're reading the Spanish, for example, translation of something that I've translated, that you are fooled for a while into believing that this is the original version. It doesn't. You can't always pull it off, but it's nice when you can. It makes you feel really really good about it. Okay, I was just checking something real quick. So the best way for me to kind of show you the process and like the complexities and the things that go into it is to walk you through a couple of, I'm calling them case studies, but it's kind of looking at different s- portions of my translation work or my work in English and in Spanish to give you a feel for how I moved into the position I'm in right now in the publishing world, and some of the considerations that I've had to take on all the different projects that I've worked on. And along the way, you'll get to see the covers of different books, and you get a feel for the scope of what I've done. So when I started out publishing, when I was 40, I'm 54 now, so it's like only 14 years ago. It feels like many decades ago, but it's only been a decade and a half. I did a lot of work that was bilingual in nature, that was like side by side English and Spanish, because I was trying to provide tools for teachers who were working with students in Deep South Texas. I was a teacher when I started doing this kind of work, and I was the director of bilingual and ESL education at a school district here in South Texas when I started publishing. So I always had in my mind the notion of creating something that would be fun and exciting for kids, but that also be useful for teachers, and something that school districts could acquire and utilize within their curriculum. It just made a lot of sense to me. There's also a very pragmatic side of it. So you need to create something that people have a reason to buy if you want to be able to continue writing, because you clearly have to make money off of writing to be able to continue doing it, right? Otherwise, I mean, you could like write for yourself, or you could write a book every few years or whatever. But if you want to do it like regularly, you've got to figure out a way to monetize it. That's an ugly word, but it's true. So I had books like Mexican Beastry, Bestiario Mexicano, which is a really cool work that I did with a friend of mine, Noe Vela, who was a painter from Mexico, and we put together this really cool kind of illustrated encyclopedia of cucuys. And it was successful in a way that made me want to continue doing that kind of work. And you can see I worked on this series. It's kind of hard to see because the red color of the cover like makes everything distort. But Strange Texas Tales That Never Die, which is kind of a ripoff of another series, uh, Tales That Must Not Die. And when I was working on these like bilingual collections, I was also because a lot of my scholarly work was the study of indigenous languages, specifically classical Nahuatl, and to a lesser extent Yucatec Maya. I put out this book, Flower Song Dance, Aztec and Maya Poetry, that won a couple of awards and got me some attention as somebody doing like interesting work in translation. So that that book, Mexican Bestiario Mexicano, was my second book. My first had been a collection of short stories that I had written um, over the years with middle school and high school students that I taught as a way. They were mostly like retellings in short story form of like legends from this area. And this book, Mexican Bestiary, got me into schools to do school visits, which was really, really great because it was a way for me to talk to kids and get them excited about stories. The kids love scary stuff. They love like pukuis, like monsters, stuff like that. So this is a way for me to get into the schools and to show teachers in my presentations how having English and Spanish versions of these legends was really, really useful. That publisher was the one who got me to work on that bilingual series of spooky stories, and he asked me to help him find Mexican American artists to illustrate it. So each one of those strange Texas Tales That Never Die stories was illustrated, heavily illustrated by a Mexican American illustrator, usually like up and coming people who really hadn't established themselves. And it was kind of like my first; those two books, my first foray into working with illustrators and like kind of like a mentoring talent and bringing them up and giving them opportunities. And that's something that I still am a super strong believer in today. And as I said, that other book, garnered me attention because there are not a lot of people translating Nahuatl text into English, especially not poets translating Nahuatl poetry into English. So it was an interesting niche to fit myself in, something that also enriched my work. Now, there is a very different process involved. When I write something in English or in Spanish and then translate it to the other language, it's a pretty straightforward thing for me. I have a voice, a writerly voice in English. I have a writerly voice in Spanish, and it's just pretty much a matter, as any of you who's ever done like live interpreting will understand, of just like reading the text in one language, having it on the screen with a Word document open over here, and just like typing it into the other language right then and there. Um, I don't mean to underplay how complex that is, but a lot of the complex work is going on inside of my brain. And it's something that I've been doing for a very long time. Like, I'm 54 years old. I grew up bilingual. It's like really hard for me to parse out what's happening, but I just have a feel. I have my master's is I have a bachelor's, a master's, and a doctorate. And my bachelor's and master's both were like majors in English, minors in Spanish. I've read a lot, mainly Mexican literature and Chicano literature over the years in Spanish, and I just have an inherent innate kind of sense for the language. And when you're in that position, when there are two languages that you are relatively similarly adept at, although yes, my schooling was in English, and so I English does have a slight leg up on Spanish. um it's just this kind of really smooth process that then you go back through and you tweak things, and sometimes the translation will cause you to stop because there will be an idiom in Spanish that you've got to find an equivalent for in English, or vice versa. Some kind of joke, a play on words or whatever that doesn't work in one language, you've got to find an equivalent for. But those are like more the exceptions than the rule. For the most part, it's pretty easy just to go through with a normal piece of prose and translate it. But going from Nahuatl, which is a language that I began to study when I was in my early 30s, and especially classical Nahuatl, which is a language that even though there are 1.5 million speakers of different variants of Nahuatl today from Central America all through Mexico, those varieties of Nahuatl are different from the classical um, version that a lot of colonial area texts were written in. So that process is a lot more intellectual. It's time consuming. You're taking a look at the Nahuatl text, teasing out the meaning, pondering really hard. How do I render the musicality of this 500-year-old poem into modern English or modern Spanish? And it's much more time consuming. It doesn't happen automatically or at all. And so those are like different types of translation. And I still do a lot of translation into Nahuatl, and I write some in Nahuatl and so forth. And I have a poetry collection coming out later this year that's got some Nahuatl poems in it. But it's still, I mean, it doesn't come to me as easily. And it made me realize that that work with Nahuatl made me focus a little bit more when I was translating into Spanish and into English, to maybe to be a little more conscious of what I was doing instead of letting it be so automatic, which really helped when I started being offered projects um, to work on other people's books. So when you're translating your own stuff, if you're the person that you've got to please. Obviously, you have to please your agent and your editor as well, but you're the primary person who has to approve of what you're doing in terms of the way you're rendering the language. When you're working with someone else, however, a whole host of other factors comes into play. So here are some of the books that I've translated over the past like 8 years. So this first one, and they're kind of in order that I've translated them. So El Verano de las Mariposas is a middle grade slash YA, like a juvenile novel by Guadalupe Garcia McCall. Now Guadalupe and I are friends, and we've actually co-written a couple of books together now. Um, and she is from the Piedras Negras Eagle Pass area, which is a few hours upriver from where I live. I grew up in the McAllen Reynosa area and now live in the Dana Rio Bravo area. And so you have to go upriver um, about 3.5 hours and you come to her community. So we are both border people. We have very similar dialects of Spanish. It's kind of like northern Spanish, South Texas. Um, we just like get each other really well, and when we speak to each other in Spanish or we're code switching, it feels really natural, like we're from the same community. But Piedras Negras is not Reynosa and Eagle Pass is not McAllen. There are differences. So when I was translating this, it was really neat to work with her to kind of negotiate some of those differences, and we had a lot of fun. It was a collaborative process that worked really well, and I'll come back to it in a second. With Efren Divided, which was the original book by Ernesto Cisneros. Ernesto Cisneros is from Southern California. So it's, obviously there you have a wider gap because like the Tejano way of speaking Spanish or the northern like Tamaulipan or Sonoran way of speaking, I guess Coahuilan in the Eagle Pass, of speaking Spanish is different than from California and Baja California. And so there was a lot more negotiation, but it was still a really great experience. And Ernesto Cisneros is also a friend of mine, and it's just like a joy. Like in his case, his book had come out in English. His mother is like the book basically is based on something from his own life, and his mother is one of the main characters in the book. And she hadn't been able to read it. And so as soon as I sent in the Word document to him saying, "Hey, I've done and finished the translation," he immediately printed it out printed out. It's wild for me to imagine. Y se lo dio a su mamá. Y su mamá lo leyó, and she started crying. And it was like a beautiful thing. She hadn't been able to access this story, and it like really drove home for me that that is one of the things that translators do is they make a story accessible to everybody in the family. When you have a family that's a blend of people who speak the different languages to different degrees, having that Spanish edition just makes it so that you can, you know, join together and share a story as one. Then I translated the "'Twas the Night Before Pride," which is a story about a queer family, who's getting ready for the Pride parade, and it was a really like fascinating project. And everybody at the publishing house and my agent, like they all looked into it, and they assured me that this is like the first picture book that was ever published in the US that was translated into non-binary Spanish. So that was a really cool project to work on because it is a queer family and there is like a non-binary child, like navigating the use of gender in Spanish and using non-binary Spanish to be respectful of that family and of the celebration. It was a challenge, but it was like a wonderful thing. And then I have friends in the trans community, and I reached out to a non-binary trans community, reached out to a non-binary friend of mine, had them like read it, and they gave me a thumbs up. They loved what I had done. So those kinds of opportunities are really great as well. And then coming out, I think, is it coming out in, I think, June? El barrio se levanta, la protesta que construyó el Parque Chicano. I mean, you guys are probably more familiar with Chicano Park than I am. That was also really fun because, again, working with somebody from Southern California, navigating those differences in our idiolects, and trying to make sure that I put across the story that the writer had written in a way that was respectful of her community there in that area. That was a lot of fun as well. And you can see here, when the book Summer of the Mariposas came out, we had some pushback from that kind of like group that I was telling you about before, those gatekeepers who want Spanish to be, like like this beautiful, perfect, pure thing. Guadalupe and I, the book is narrated from the perspective of a Chicana living in Eagle Pass whose family is from Mexico. We wanted the voice of the character to reflect that identity, and we made all kinds of deliberate choices about the words that she would use and the syntax and so forth. And like that's all one reviewer could see. The reviewer for Kirkus was just like, this Spanish is way too influenced by English, without ever wondering, was that done on purpose? It was like a kind of gotcha, moment where like, no, this is not a really good translation into Spanish, because people are not used to, or certainly weren't used to when the book came out, books being translated into geographically specific regional dialects of Spanish. It was really, really hard for them to get. They're so used to books being translated into just kind of like flat, globally accessible variety of Spanish that no one actually speaks. Like when you're watching HBO and you put on the Spanish language track, and everywhere people are like maldición, that kind of stuff. It's like not the way anybody actually talks. And the minute you try to reflect the way people actually speak, but you do it in a translation, they get their hackles up. It freaks some of them out. But the sales were really great. Kids have responded really well to the book. It's like had multiple printings, and so we feel really good about it. And we wrote a couple of responses that were published here and there, just trying to explain what our process had been. When I came to a Friend Divided, and translated that there, Ernesto Cisneros and I had a couple of like these back and forth because our backgrounds are very different, and where he would have characters be like dude and homie and stuff like that, and I'd be translating it way and essay or whatever. He didn't like want that. He didn't want anything that to his mind smacked of like the street, even though like I argued that the way he was making people speak in English smacked of like street. But ultimately it's his book, and so I had to be respectful of his choices. And we found a way to navigate it. But I think that part of the push and pull there is obviously he really wanted his family to be able to read that book, and he didn't want to overdo like the street aspects of it. And also, I mean, I come from a community where it is a lot more common. Where like my wife and my oldest daughter, who's 31, might say to each other, "Hey, way, ¿qué onda, way?" And that in Ernesto's family is kind of like off limits. You just don't do that kind of thing. And so there's also, a personal perspective on language that you have to like consider when you're working, especially when you're working with a friend. You want to be super respectful of them and you don't want to push back too hard. Had it been a total stranger, I might have like put up a bigger fight, but ultimately his justifications, yeah, made sense. And it is his book, so we'll do what he wants, right? Um this next thing, you've got to be because it hasn't been announced yet, so don't say anything about it. In fact, I mean, I wonder like if I should even show up because it's like gonna be on Facebook. I'm gonna flash it really quick and then I'm gonna move on. So you guys, oh man, no, I better not do it. Okay, I'm gonna flip to the side really quick and you may see it. Boop, boop. Ah, did you see that? So yeah, I'm gonna be working on a big project translating a kind of classic of children's literature of recent years into Spanish again, and that's always a fun thing to do to take a book that's already been translated into Spanish and find a new way to translate it, to find a new way in that makes it more accessible and more I don't know, relevant, I suppose, to a modern audience. Let me take a sip of water. So, I love doing that. I love translating from English to Spanish. Super important to me. Now that I have a grandson, it's like really, really cool to make sure that there are, picture books and other things that that he has access to that are written in Spanish. But I also do a lot of translation from Spanish to English as well. And these are, I guess I do fewer of them because these are books that are coming usually from Latin America into the US market. And we do less and less of that. I mean, I wish we were doing a lot more of it. It's one of, I guess, the downsides to the rise in production of literature in Spanish by U.S. Latinos. So a couple of things here. I translated this book that was originally published in Mexico. I think it was called Diccionario de Mitos de América in Mexico, written by Maria Garcia Esperon, illustrated by Amanda Mijangos, who's given a talk in the series as well. And this one was a really great project to translate, and I'll talk about some of the complexities in just a second. Um, and then I also translated The Immortal Boy by Francisco Montaña Ibáñez, which was originally published in Colombia under the title No Comas Renacuajos, which is a title that would not have worked in English. Don't eat tadpoles. That just would not have worked. It is, yeah. So let me talk a little bit about that. With the the Dictionary of Myths of the Americas, as it would have been called if we had translated that way, um, this compendium was put together by Maria Garcia Esperon in an alphabetical order as a way to just give an overview of some of the major myths that she really found appealing, and she rewrote them, retold them in a very lyrical Spanish, and she opened each one of those um, alphabetically ordered chapters or stories with a quaint little poem that kind of like thematically opened the thing up. It was very lovely. The illustrations are beautiful. Just an amazing piece of work. But Levine Querido, the U.S. publisher, founded by Arthur Levine, who used to be with Scholastic, the guy who brought Harry Potter to the U.S., he saw this book at the Frankfurt Book Festival, acquired it. They showed it to me and asked me whether I'd be interested in translating it, and I was. But like immediately, there were a couple of things that we realized, like. These are stories from all over North and South America, from different indigenous groups. We were going to have more eyes on it. And what we also wanted to do was to go back to the source text, the original text, and pull more story from them, and like build those stories out a little bit. And then there were a couple things missing. They wanted a little more LGBTQ content, so I retold a couple of stories from Mexico, from indigenous traditions in Mexico. And then we had a whole bunch of, like 12 different cultural experts from different places throughout the Americas read them and give us feedback, because we just knew that the the US market, the English market in North America in general, like Canada and the US, is going to be less forgiving of retellings of indigenous stories that are not respectful and faithful, so like that. So we had to be like very, very careful in crafting that. And then it was really interesting because they also had the rights to produce a Spanish version for the US market. So then I had to go back, had to sounds really terrible, but I had the joy of going back and translating all the material that I had added into Spanish, and reincorporating it into Maria Garcia Perón's original text. And they got Amanda Mijangos to do a couple more illustrations. And the book has really been a major success, and it won a translation award from American Library Association. It's a great thing. Something similar happened, not as extensive at all, but when I was translating No Comas Renacuajos, Colombian Spanish is so much different from my native dialect of like Northern Mexican Spanish, that and I have lots of friends from Colombia, and I've read like tons of literature from Colombia, but I had to like constantly check in with the author and be like, am I understanding what you've written here? Because this is a little weird. And there were some things, because of the use of tú and usted in Colombia, that I had to like completely retool certain scenes so that they could have a similar like shocking impact on one of the child narrators, when her counselor shifts from usted to tú. There was really no way to make that happen in English, so I had to like go the other direction and have the counselor go from being like really, you know, informal and sweet like you would be to a child, to being formal. And the author was like, wow, I don't know about that. And I'm like, if you can think of another way to have the same impact, let me know. And he's like, well, it's obviously not my language. I'm going to trust you. So there's like an element of, authors having to trust the translators when it's being translated. If somebody translates one of my books to German, I'm going to have to trust the German translator. I don't know. I mean, I know a little bit German, but not enough to determine whether what's the way it's being rendered makes the most sense. And and the other problem with what I call the Immortal Boy, that I came up with that title, and Libyan could either ran with it, was that the way people think about juvenile literature in Latin America is different from the way we do in the US. We have, publishers in the US, the big five, have created a particular market for YA and middle grade. They have set the boundaries. They've determined all these different things about taste and content. And when you bring something from another country that doesn't adhere to those strictures, it's complicated. You translate it, and it maybe sometimes doesn't work for a reader who's just come off of like the latest best-selling YA novel, and then they read The Immortal Boy and they're like, what the heck is this? This is so weird. The voices there. So I did as much as I could to craft a voice that would resonate with US readers, but it was really, really complicated. And it was really, really interesting. I found out after the book came out and it won a couple of awards, that it was the first book in like 5 years, the first YA novel from a Latin American country that had been translated into English in the US. Like, it's just not done. Nobody does it. It was just really, really wild. I wish we saw more of it. It would be great. Okay, because I want to leave time for questions. I want to go through the rest of this pretty fast here. 5 more minutes, and then we'll stop for some questions. I see them building up in the little Q&A box in front of me. And then, I guess maybe the easiest of all these is the Spanish versions of my own work. So here you'll see, probably like my most famous book is They Call Me Güero. And not long after it came out from the small press Cinco Puntos Press, which is now an imprint of Lee and Low, Penguin Random House expressed an interest in acquiring the rights to put out the Spanish version, and which is kind of unusual, right? Little Cinco Puntos Press out in El Paso, and there's Penguin Random House, one of the biggest of the big five, wanting to put out a Spanish version. That's really, really great. And as things worked out, that book ended up eventually with Penguin Random House when Cinco Puntos um, closed its, shuttered its doors, and then eventually became an imprint. And they also published the sequel. They call her Fregona, Le dicen Fregona. And these two are novels in verse. So, as you can imagine, in other words, they're books told in poems, right? Um, and the complicating factor is that Güero, the narrator, likes to play around with formal poetry, with like sonnets and haiku and pantoums and all stuff like that. So whenever I'm doing the Spanish version of it, I can't just translate. I have to recreate the poem from scratch, kind of like using the same ideas that are contained in it, because like rhyme schemes and all these kinds of things just don't work. That kind of like refrains and repetitions that work in one language don't work in the other language, and it made it complicated but really, really fun to put together. Then we have my two border towns, which was simultaneously published as Mis dos pueblos fronterizos. And then there's the case of Noche Antigua, or Ancient Night, which is, I'll come back to it in a second, but it's also done really well. Like 6 stars, and 6-star reviews. It's doing really well. A couple others. There's one that's coming up next month, El Príncipe y la Coyote. Yes, La Coyote. I know. That was something, again, another fight. They wanted to be like El Coyote, and I'm like, no, it's a female coyote. And throughout the book, he's going La Coyote, La Coyote. I'm not going to say El Coyote, but you can do that because the masculine gender is a deal. I know, yes, I studied Spanish, I freaking know, but we're going to call it La Coyote, all right? And don't push me, because we'll call it La Coyota, and then you'll really be upset with me. Uh, all right. And this is like a novel historical fiction about Nezahualcóyotl when he was a teenager and on the run from the Tepanec Empire and trying to survive to retake Texcoco, and together with his uncles create the Aztec Empire, the Triple Alliance. It's a really, really fun book to create. And then a couple of my graphic novels here. I have 2 graphic novel series, Curandera Mecánica, Clockwork Curandera, that I created with Raul III, Raul Gonzalez, great illustrator, storyteller, and Legends of the Feathered Serpent, or Leyendas de la Serpiente Emplumada, which I do with my daughter. She's a really great illustrator and graphic novelist. And there is, I've already talked about the complexity of the English and Spanish version of the novel in verse. Um, my book, My Two Border Towns, is, it won the Tomas Rivera Mexican American Children's Book Award. It's, sold really well. It's sold like, I don't know, nearly 60,000 copies or whatever in the 2 years that it's been out. But it was recently in the news because PS 55, Staten Island in New York City, threw hundreds of books in the trash as a neighbor was watching, and went and pulled them out. And among them was this picture book of mine that, talks about the wonderful life that a little boy lives on the border, and how excited he is to be able to go back and forth and visit his relatives and so forth. But how he also befriends a boy from Cuba who's one of the asylum seekers that's kind of camped out on the bridge. And apparently, I don't know if you know about Staten Island, it's a pretty conservative place, and they just didn't like this humane depiction of asylum seekers, and they didn't want their kids to be exposed to um, the idea that we should treat them with humanity. And it's really kind of sad. And so, yeah, that yeah. Book was in the news. The thing I wanted to mention about Ancient Night was that it was published originally as a wordless picture book in Mexico back in 2015. And again, Levin Querido acquired the translation rights. But how do you translate a book that has no text, right? Um, it the images tell a combined story of the origin of the sun and the moon, from different Mesoamerican indigenous traditions. I was very familiar with the story. I've like told it myself in a couple of different books, and so I was able to craft like an English version like an English text that would go along with it, and then the Spanish version of that text as well. And it was just really interesting because you usually do it the other way around. You usually start with the text, then you go on to the images. But with Prince and the Coyote, because it's a that book, which is about it's a thick book, which I had handy. It's like you pick it up and it weighs, it's hefty. That book is a hybrid. It is mostly prose, but also has poetry woven in and out. And some of that poetry is actual the poems of Nezahualcóyotl that have endured to this day that I've retranslated into English for the book, and then other poems that I've written in that voice, in that same voice, that are woven in and out. And so I had to like be thinking about I'm translating this novel into English, and so when I'm doing the Spanish version, I don't want to start with the English version of his poems. I want to go back to the novel and retranslate the novel into Spanish. So it's made things more complex, but it was a lot of fun. And then the last thing I'll mention here is graphic novels. Graphic novels and comics are really great, but English is a more economic language. You could say something in 5 words that in Spanish you need 7 to 10 words to say. And the problem with that is in graphic novels, you can only have a certain number of words per panel on the page, right? Like usually 25. And so that means that when you're making the Spanish version, you have to find ways to compress the language even further. And you're always like, can this be pithier? Can I figure out a way to say this with fewer words? And it is an interesting challenge to say the least. And so I'm going to stop here. I just have lathered away for a long time. And Beto, maybe you can help me out with some of these questions. I don't know if you've gone through them. Are there some that we should focus on? You're muted. You're muted, Beto. Beto, you're muted.
Ay, perdón.
It's okay.
I keep going and going.
I was like, no,
Este,
ya se agarró preguntándome algo y no la escucho.
and I was saying that thank you so much for such a great presentation. So much content, so much to learn. My mind was all over like this thinking and making all these notes. I think we need a second part.
Right? Yes, I totally am down for it. So
Yeah, so we do have several questions from the audience. Let's start with Andrea Rocha. She's asking, well, first, thanking you for your presentation. Can you please talk about gender neutrality in non-binary translation from English to Spanish, especially in the context of books for kids? Gracias.
yeah, no, I mean, it is something. I'll be honest with you. For the most part, I don't use non-binary Spanish. I don't speak non-binary Spanish in my community. My community would not understand what was going on if I went down to like my local tortilleria and I started using non-binary Spanish with them, ordering barbacoa or whatever. But in certain contexts, for certain texts, for certain authors who are trying to accomplish certain thing, non-binary Spanish can be used. What is probably more common is to use a Spanish that is as gender neutral as you possibly can, or that plays with gender in ways that offset the default masculine, right? So if I like, you'll hear me say all the time, da 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 da, la gente latina, instead of saying los latinos, saying la gente latina. So I'm creating a feminine construction so that, or instead of saying mis amigos, I might say mis amistades. Just these, we all know these different like constructions that we can use to make language less um just less masculine by default. And it evolved that way. It's not like it was some kind of, conspiracy that made Spanish and the other languages that have a default masculine for the plural or for, the people whose gender identity we don't know. But once we become aware of it and we understand how it plays into systemic oppression or like reflects it, even though maybe that wasn't why it came into being. It's I think important for us to push back against that, and we're not. I don't think we can ever do it perfectly. The language will evolve as it evolves. There are people, Gen Z and Gen Alpha Spanish speakers in Latin American countries that I have heard on YouTube and TikTok or whatever that now use non-binary Spanish that literally are like, cuando les latines, da 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 da, and it like just effortlessly just comes off of the tongue for them. And I suspect that, eventually it could reach, a point where that will start spreading and become part of the language. So that happens all the time. People's practice, the way they use the language, influences it. But still, it's in the present day when you're translating into Spanish, you are more likely to get a broader readership if you are being balanced in your approach and not being overly progressive in the way you're translating Spanish, but not overly conservative either. You're trying to find a middle way that is respectful of the readers, and doesn't harm comprehension ultimately, right? Uh, That's a very long-winded way of avoiding the question altogether.
Mhm. Oh, thank you. Let's go with the next one from Liam Gregg, and she's asking a really interesting question about your career. Because you did mention that you were a teacher before starting to write books,
Mhm. Yeah, yeah.
and she's asking about why did you decide to pick up the pen and start writing? Do you have any idea that it would take you, where would it take you to where you are now?
Yeah, no, I couldn't have imagined that it would take me where I am now. I mean, I grew up in a family of storytellers, and so I was always in love with storytelling, and I learned how to read when I was really young. So it came, clear to me at some point in, all my reading in school, that there was something missing from all the books that I was loving, and that was like my family and my community. And at some point when I was in high school, I started getting the idea that I might want to write stories that centered, Chicano lives, Tejano lives. And in fact, when I was 17, I had an English teacher who encouraged me to enter a novel writing contest, and I wrote a short. This is 1987. I wrote a short, um, comedy science fiction novel that had a Chicano protagonist. I did not win the contest, but I wrote this, like, it was basically a novella, like about 30,000 words, when I was 17, and it just showed me that I could do it. That if I wanted to pursue that, I could. And I was the first person in my family to go to college. I went to college and studied English and Spanish, and got married about halfway through my college career and then had a kid. And so, trying to figure out what to do was no longer feasible for me just to like jump into writing. I was like, okay, let me go into teaching. I had some good teachers that helped me along the way. Let me be that kind of teacher for kids. Let me bring in the kind of literature that I'd like to be writing. And as I mentioned, my first book was a collection of short stories that I wrote with my kids. So yeah, I was, I guess when I really started doing the kind of work I'm doing now was when I was a teacher of seventh graders and started retelling the stories my grandmother Garza had told me when I was a kid in short story form to use with reluctant readers in seventh grade, and they responded really well. So yeah.
Oh, thank you. Here the next one from Adriana Moreno de Vares. She says, I make an effort to give bilingual books as gifts to friends who are new parents to kick off their kiddos' library, but I have found several that are literal translations or they geared for non-Mexican Spanish speakers, like guagua instead of autobús or camión
Yeah.
for bus. I am Mexican and live in Los Angeles. Would you share names or of folks whom you consider good translators and also translators who translate primarily for a Mexican Chicano audience?
Yeah. So I mean, the two that popped in my mind right away are Aida Salazar and Carmen Tafoya. They do really good Spanish translations, that are geared for a Mexican Chicano audience. Um, you're gonna put me on the spot here. Who else can I mention? I mean, obviously mine. um, it's somebody who knows how to straddle the that difference is Jasmine Mendez, who's from Houston. She is Dominicana, but she's married to a Chicano, and so in her own work is reflective of her identity. But when she translates, she's able to, if she's translating, you know, a Mexican or Chicano author, be able to navigate that. Her Mexican Spanish is flawless. She's able to code switch between Dominican and Mexican Spanish. It's adorable. It's so cool. So those are three women that I really, really admire. But there are others out there. If just because there's not a lot of time, shoot me an email at bullsdo@gmail.com. Or you can just go to my website, davidbowles.us, and then you'll find my contact information. And shoot me an email reminding me we talked about this, and I'll send you some more names. Okay.
Awesome, thank you. I think we'll all appreciate the list of other suggestions, David. So
Absolutely, I'm happy
we
to.
can follow up on this. Yes. I know we have a few minutes, so let's try to get as many possible. So this one is asking about your experience with publishing houses. Deborah Maldonado Deoli, she's asking about, have you had an opportunity to publish your translations with publishing houses like Arte Público Press or Piñata Press? If so, how was the
Yeah,
experience?
no, I mean, Arte Público, I mean, I don't want to talk. I love them. I love Dr. Canelos and the rest of the team over there, but I never published anything with them because they early on rejected one of my manuscripts that then went on to win the Pura author honor and stuff like that. So I'm not gonna I don't want to rub it in their faces. I joke with them sometimes. But I have lots of friends who have published with Piñata Books, the imprint Piñata Books of Arte Publico, and yeah, no, they're decent publishers. It is a small regional press. It doesn't have the same resources as like Penguin Random House or HarperCollins, some of these other presses that I publish with, Bloomsbury. But they do right by their authors and by the illustrators. They create really beautiful products, and there are a lot of people that know that a book from Arte Público is going to be a quality book that's going to culturally relevant for kids. And so, yeah, no, I mean, in general, I think they put out really good stuff.
And this is a question. I think she's referring, Deborah Maldonado, to your books, the books that you mentioned in the presentation. Have they been sold to readers in Latin America?
Well, in Mexico, yeah, the most of my books that are out from Penguin Random House, they call me Güero, they call her Ferona. Also, my book, Feather Serpent Dark Heart of Sky, is out in the Spanish version in Mexico. So yeah, I mean, not all of my books, but like several of them are on for sale in Mexico. I don't know. I don't think the rest of Latin America, but definitely in Mexico.
This is a good one from Irma Olmedo. She's asking have you ever needed to include a glossary in your books? I translated one of my books, which partly used Puerto Rican Spanish from New York City with some
Anglicismos.
anglicisms,
Yeah, yeah.
and use a glossary explaining some of the vocabulary and terms.
Yeah. No, I have. And for they call me Güero and they call her Ferona, especially because those there's a lot of code switching in them. There are like entire stanzas and poems that are in Spanish. And so I definitely included a glossary in the back so that people who are not as well versed in Spanish or not as fluent can refer to those. I think that I don't like the idea of interrupting the text or having footnotes or making it artificially like explained right afterwards in parentheses or something like that. But I do think that having a glossary is as a nice gesture, because there are going to be people who are monolingual speakers of English or who are maybe bilingual but it's not in Spanish, who are going to want to access your book. So it makes sense to do that. I think that was smart on your part.
And Gina Rodriguez is asking if you could please elaborate a little bit on the Diccionario de Mitos de América and how it translated into the US.
So I mean, yeah, absolutely. So Océano, right? Was it Océano? Or not? I can't remember what it's. A publisher in Mexico published it. And then what happens is a lot of international publishers take their work to Frankfurt every year for this international book festival. It's like the biggest one, right? And a lot of US publishers go to that looking for likely books to bring to the US. This is how Arthur Levine found Harry Potter and brought it to Scholastic, the first Harry Potter book. And that same man, Arthur Levine, found the Diccionario de Mitos de América there, at Frankfurt at the book festival, and like fell in love with the art and stuff like that. He knows some Spanish, so he was able to like read it cursorily. Got a PDF from the publisher, asked me to take a look at it and give him an idea of whether it was worth publishing. I thought it was beautiful. I said, "This is great." And then he was like, "Okay, well, if we acquire it, will you translate it?" And I'm like, "Yes, let's do it." So I mean, that's how simple it was. Publishers are looking for good things to translate, and if it's got like una buena presentación, um, buenas ilustraciones y un español así movido y conmovedor, they're gonna take an interest in it. Um, anyway, that's how it happened.
David, I know it's already 6. We have 4 more questions. I'm not sure if you have time to take those questions or we can.
If you want to stay a little bit longer, I have time.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, thank you. So Betsy Sanchez Leones is asking if there is a movement to translate audiobooks into Spanish.
There's there's definitely, I wouldn't say a movement yet, but there's initial push. There's interest in it. Um, the One of the problems obviously is a lot of audiobooks are produced professionally using professional narrators. Um, and so what has to happen is we have to finish with the shift that's happening where more and more writers of children's literature are narrating their own books. So like I narrated The Sea Ringed World, Sacred Stories of the Americas, the translation of Diccionario de Mitos de América. And that was a really great audiobook because they were like, who can we find who's able to pronounce all these indigenous names from all over the Americas? And I'm like, I don't think you're gonna find anybody. I could do it though. And they're like, would you? And yes. So that's what's gonna happen first. First, you have to have an acknowledgement by the audiobook production industry that authors ought to be their starting point. That they ought to start with authors. Can you do this audiobook? Can you narrate it? And then after that, going, and if that doesn't work out, finding professional people, because then, those people would be best equipped. Because right now there's just not a huge um like set of narrators who can narrate in Spanish. There's a small number of them, and in order for that to grow, we need more narrators. Just like the same thing with translation, we need more translators. If you're listening to me right now and you are adept at Spanish, and you like to write or whatever, there could be, some really good opportunities for you in children's literature and translating books into Spanish. So
Okay. Oh, thank you. Do you know of any folks that are working with art institutions who translate descriptions of exhibits? I was happily surprised to see information materials translated into Spanish in Phoenix museums, but that's not the case in Los Angeles. Is that something truly needed in my community?
yeah, no, it is definitely needed. But basically what happens there though is that, museums and educational organizations that have galleries and so forth, they're internally making those decisions. There's not any kind of really organizational unifying kind of movement to ensure that. There is this understanding in um, curatorship that you ought to make exhibits as accessible to your community as possible. And so it really strikes me as odd that you could have museums and galleries in Los Angeles or anywhere in Southern California, and they wouldn't have descriptions in Spanish. It seems so at odds with what makes sense. Like you literally have a massive, Spanish speaking community in Southern California, and to ignore them, to act like they are unlikely to ever go to a museum is, yeah, I mean, it borders on insulting, right? I don't know how to feel about it. It's not good, but that is something, there isn't any kind of group that I'm plugged into that is doing that kind of work, that's pushing for that. Um, but that, I do think that we ought to be.
We have these two last questions. I'll read them both because they're kind of related.
Yeah.
Kaylin Don is asking, do you think in Spanish or English? And then the other one from Sofia Trevino, Kiffen, she's asking about your biggest struggle in your career and how do you overcome it?
Yeah. So I think that bilingual people, in the first place, I'm not entirely sure that we actually think in one and think in language. I think that we think in like ideas, and that the ideas then get transmitted into language the closer we get to expressing those ideas out loud. I think that that's borne out by a lot of linguistics and cognitive science. We're not like using words to compose our thoughts. It's like at a deeper level. And then those ideas bubble up, and they become words as we get closer to expressing them. And so whatever language is I'm talking in, whatever language I'm like maybe listening to the TV in or reading in. That's the language that these ideas bubble up into my mind in. So it'll be English or Spanish depending. Probably more often English when I'm living in, because I live in the U.S. part of the year and I live in Mexico part of the year. So when we have a house in El Zapotal, which is a Zapotec community on the coast of Oaxaca near Mazunte, close to Puerto Escondido. And when I'm down there, like I'm just around Spanish all the time, and everybody's speaking Spanish. All the media you're consuming is Spanish, and so like you're like when ideas occur to you, they bubble up in Spanish. So yeah, I know that's not a very satisfactory kind of explanation, but yeah, that's the way it is. And like, if you want to ask me, do I dream? When I dream, sometimes people are speaking in English, sometimes they're speaking in Spanish. It's whatever, right? And then the other question about the barriers. Yes, I've had barriers. One of them, the biggest barriers I had early on was trying to get an agent, because agents were like, because you try to get an agent, you send them like a sample of your work, you introduce yourself, you give a synopsis of the book, whatever, and they would always be like, "Wow, there's a lot of Spanish in this book." And you have all these names of like Aztec and Maya gods, and they're really hard. They're so long. Could you bring in like a white sidekick maybe for the Mexican kids so that there's some translation of these ideas? Could you maybe shorten? Do we have to say Quetzalcoatl? Can you say Quetzal for short? Like, no, 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 no. And so because I stuck to my guns, they were like, well, I just don't know how I could possibly, I don't, represent, I don't know where it would fit in the marketplace. And I'm like, yeah, well, you're not the one for me. Once I started winning awards from the American Library Association, all those agents circled back and they were like, oh, hey, I saw you in the news the other day. I'm like, ahora sí. Sí, ya quieres hablar. It's so funny. But yeah, there's a real. You maybe have seen some of the recent research. There, Lee and Low, one of the groups that I publish with, they're owned and run mostly by people of color, people from communities of color. They do this survey every year, every couple of years, called the Baseline Survey of Publishing, and their recent survey shows the same thing. 75% of publishing is white cishet women from the East Coast, and middle class, upper middle class backgrounds, stuff like that. And then there's a particular idea of quality that cultural bubble creates, right? And anything that doesn't fit that bubble is, they're like, what? ¿Qué es esto? And that is the challenge for people who write with a voice that doesn't just ape what's in the marketplace already. So the trick is, this is what I teach the students I mentor all the time, is use the language that you find in middle grade and YA and children's literature, but then subvert it. Then like insert in your particular voice, your calor, your geographic specificity. And then once you establish yourself and people see that your books are selling well, whatever, then they let you do what you want to do. It's always that first, like just getting in the door. And the other thing that I do is just try to hold the door open for people. And like there are now, when I started publishing, um, there were only a couple of hundred books every year written by gente Latina being published, and now that's kind of doubled in 10 years. So it's nice. There are more of us, and the bigger our community grows, the more power we have within the publishing industry, and the more we can like hold the door open. I co-founded with Miriam Gurba and Roberto Lobato uh, a group, like a hashtag activist movement called Dignidad Literaria, and we fought against Macmillan and their book American Dirt, and like the investment of so many millions of dollars into like one book written by somebody who's not from Central America or Mexico about the immigrant experience going through Mexico. And we brought them to the negotiating table and forced them to come up with a plan to increase Latina representation in their publishing house. And so that's the kind of work that we're doing, because it is hard to get in. And if the people who are in, if we aren't helping those people come, our the people that we're mentoring, the rest of the people in our community have great stories to tell. If we're not holding the door open for them, then like, what the hell are we doing, right? So that's the work that is now out there for me. I'm an established writer. I've got 36 books out. People admire me. I've won lots of awards. Y ahora me toca hacer que esos sueños sean realidad para otros. And that's, and changing minds and hearts within the industry is part of it. So